1,000 years. That is the span of time historians call the Dark Ages. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 to the rebirth of Europe in the Renaissance. But when you turn the pages of history, you do not see darkness. You see emptiness, a chilling void, where wars, discoveries, inventions, and ideas should be, but aren't. We are told this was a time of ignorance, superstition, and chaos, that Europe fell asleep while the rest of the world marched forward, that for nearly a millennium nothing of importance happened. But pause for a moment. How could that be? How could an entire continent that once gave us Aristotle, Cicero, and Archimedes suddenly produce nothing but silence? And more importantly, who decided to call it the Dark Ages in the first place? The answer leads us not to barbarians or plagues, but to the one institution that survived Rome's fall, the Church. When Rome crumbled, the Vatican rose, and with it rose a monopoly over knowledge itself. Libraries burned, schools vanished, texts were destroyed, rewritten or hidden in secret vaults. The only surviving manuscripts were those approved, copied, and controlled by the clergy. For centuries, Europe knew only what the Church allowed it to know. Was this darkness a reality, or was it manufactured? Was history truly lost, or deliberately concealed? Tonight, we step into that silence. We will follow the hidden trails of missing centuries, fabricated rulers, lost inventions, forbidden books, and secret archives buried beneath Vatican stone. Because perhaps the Dark Ages were never dark at all. Perhaps they were engineered to appear that way. And so our story begins in the year 476, the day Rome fell, and Europe's memory was sealed. 476 A.D., the year the Western Roman Empire fell. History tells us this was the moment Europe slipped into shadow, the so-called Dark Ages. But was it really darkness, or was it something else entirely? Picture the city of Rome. Its marble streets once echoed with triumphal parades, senators debating in the forum, gladiators fighting for glory. But in that fateful year, there was no grand funeral for the empire, no solemn bells tolling the death of a civilization. Instead, the fall of Rome happened almost quietly. The last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a boy, not yet a man, was deposed by a barbarian general named Odoacer. A transfer of power so bloodless, so uneventful, that those alive at the time scarcely realized history had shifted beneath their feet. And then, silence. The chronicles we expect to find, our letters, memoirs, speeches, are missing. The vast Roman machine of bureaucracy and record-keeping seems to dissolve into mist. From the 5th to the 8th century, history itself thins. Events are fragmented, timelines blur, and the once detailed story of Europe becomes a blank canvas. Was this a natural collapse? Or was it something more deliberate, a curtain being drawn across the stage of history? The vanishing of records. If Rome had truly collapsed, surely the shock waves would have been documented. Empires do not fall unnoticed, and yet the records are eerily absent. A whole continent, it seems, fell into a strange sleep. Letters from statesmen vanish. Philosophical debates grow silent. Where once Rome had produced Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, now there are only fragments, scribbled notes left by monks centuries later, as if filling in gaps with vague memories rather than eyewitness accounts. Even more curious, while Europe's pen grew silent, other civilizations flourished with ink. In China, the Sui and Tang dynasties were ushering in a golden age of poetry, invention, and statecraft. Block printing appeared. Musical instruments evolved. Literature reached new heights. In the Arab world, scholars translated Greek texts, invented algebra, established public hospitals, and mapped the stars with astonishing accuracy. In India, mathematics advanced with the concept of zero, and medical traditions refined surgery and healing practices. While the East blazed with progress, Europe, the heir to Rome's grandeur, appeared empty. Why? The silence is more than a mystery. It is a contradiction, because Rome's collapse was not as total as we imagine. The city did not crumble into rubble overnight. Its aqueducts still carried water. Its walls still stood. Life, in many ways, went on. And yet, in the way history is written, an entire millennium is painted in darkness. Here, one name surfaces again and again, not an emperor, not a scholar, not a general, but the church. When the Western Empire crumbled, power did not simply vanish. It shifted. Rome ceased to be a political capital and instead became a spiritual one. And the Christian church, once a persecuted sect, now rose with a new kind of authority. An authority not over armies or trade routes, but over memory itself. The Caesars had ruled the body. The church now ruled the soul. Imagine the libraries of Rome, scrolls of Aristotle, Archimedes, Pythagoras, documents on medicine, mechanics, astronomy. After the fall, many of these were either burned, discarded, or copied only under strict supervision by clerical scribes. But copying was not neutral. Ancient Greek and Roman works were not simply preserved word for word. They were rewritten, translated into a narrower, more restrictive ecclesiastical Latin. Subtleties of meaning were lost. Interpretations were bent toward theology. Knowledge, once a light to guide humanity, became a tool to control it. Thousands of texts labeled heretical or pagan were quietly destroyed, or worse, hidden, not lost in chaos but sealed in vaults where only select priests could decide their fate. Was this preservation, or was it censorship disguised as care? Here is where the story takes a chilling turn. What if the Dark Ages were not a time when humanity forgot, but a time when humanity was not allowed to remember? Consider this. While Rome's engineers once built aqueducts that carried water across mountains, by the 7th century, Europeans had supposedly forgotten even how to build proper roads. How does an entire civilization unlearn so much? Perhaps they didn't. Perhaps they were taught to forget. The church emerged as the sole authority on what could be remembered, what could be copied, what could be told. Schools dissolved, secular libraries closed, scholars fled or were silenced. The only voices left were those in monasteries, and those voices spoke through scriptures, doctrine, and sermons. Knowledge did not vanish. It was filtered. This strange silence left behind unsettling questions that historians still wrestle with today. Why do centuries of European history appear blank, while Asia and the Middle East recorded every detail? Why do so many medieval popes and rulers have little to no evidence they ever existed beyond church records? Why do certain kings and events seem to mirror earlier history as though copied and pasted with new names? Was this merely coincidence or deliberate reconstruction? Some theories, like the controversial phantom time hypothesis, go as far as suggesting that centuries were fabricated, entire dynasties invented, and time itself manipulated to suit the needs of emperors and popes. Whether or not this radical idea is true, one fact remains. The church was the only institution powerful enough to guard, edit, or even rewrite the story of Europe. And so the Dark Ages begin, not with fire and ruin, but with silence. A silence deep enough to swallow centuries. A silence enforced not by armies, but by authority over words. A silence that transformed history into doctrine and memory into faith. But was this silence merely the absence of progress? Or was it the most calculated crime in history? The theft of time itself? The answer lies in what comes next. After Rome's collapse, the old world did not simply vanish. Its bones remained. Aqueducts stretching across valleys, amphitheaters looming silent, temples stripped of their gods but still standing. What disappeared was not stone, but memory. And in that void, one power rose above all, the Church. Barely 3 centuries before Rome's fall, Christianity had been a hunted faith. Its followers were thrown to lions, burned in gardens, crucified along roadsides. Yet, by the 5th century, the very empire that once crushed it was gone, and Christianity stood untouched. A survivor. This survival granted the Church something no other institution possessed: legitimacy. It was not merely still standing. It claimed to be chosen by God to endure, and from that claim it built a new empire. No longer did armies enforce order. No longer did senators debate law. Authority now rested in pulpits, monasteries, and altars. The Caesars ruled men's bodies. The Church would rule their souls. But ruling souls required more than sermons. It required rewriting the story of the past. In dimly lit monasteries, monks bent over parchment, their quills scratching hour after hour. It was here, not in royal palaces, that the history of Europe was rewritten. The rules were simple. Only texts approved by the Church were copied. Heretical works, those of pagan philosophers, rival gospels, forbidden sciences, were destroyed. The language itself was altered. Ancient Latin, rich in law, philosophy, and science, gave way to ecclesiastical Latin. Narrower, heavily theological, accessible only to trained clerics. Imagine the works of Aristotle or Cicero, stripped of nuance, reshaped through a theological lens. A word that once described natural order might now be translated as divine will. A principle of geometry might be reframed as allegory for faith. Knowledge was not lost. It was filtered, edited, reframed. And outside those stone walls, silence. No schools, no secular libraries, no independent scholars left to question what had been changed. History became scripture, scripture became truth, and truth could not be challenged. Consider the names of early medieval popes: Felix III, Gelasius I, Symmachus, Hormisdas. For many of them, no independent records exist outside church manuscripts. Were they real men or symbols created to fill a gap? Even kings and dynasties seem to echo earlier rulers. Some appear almost as copies, new names stamped onto old templates. And so, suspicion creeps in. If the past could be rewritten to suit theology, what prevented the Church from rewriting rulers themselves? Was the Dark Age a period of collapse, or was it a stage set carefully by those who controlled the pens? The Church understood something profound. To control memory is to control the present. If people could not access Aristotle directly, they would only know Aristotle as interpreted by priests. If Plato was quoted at all, it would be as a voice confirming doctrine, not challenging it. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all were absorbed into theology. A proof became a metaphor. An experiment became a moral lesson. knowledge ceased to be a light for discovery. It became a chain of obedience, and this was not enforced by swords. It was enforced by silence, to question, to probe, to doubt. This was heresy, punishable by death. From the 5th to the 9th century, Europe leaves behind almost nothing of consequence. No new architectural wonders rival Rome's. No great philosophers emerge. No maps are drawn that expand the world. It is as if the continent was placed in a cage of memory. Meanwhile, across the seas, civilizations soared. The Tang dynasty charted the skies. Islamic scholars invented algebra, refined medicine, and preserved thousands of Greek works the Vatican would later claim had been lost. Indian astronomers tracked eclipses with precision unmatched in the West for centuries. Europe, by contrast, appeared to sleep. But perhaps it was not asleep. Perhaps it was sedated. After the fall of Rome, power no longer belonged to warriors in armor. It belonged to scribes in robes. Every book copied, every word rewritten, every silence imposed was another brick in a new fortress, not of stone, but of memory. And in this fortress, the past was not preserved. It was designed. The Dark Ages may not have been an age of ignorance at all. They may have been an age of engineering, the engineering of history itself. History is not only what happened, it is what has been recorded. But what happens when entire centuries may never have existed at all? In the late 20th century, a bold theory sent shock waves through the academic world, the phantom time hypothesis. It claims that between the years 614 and 911 A.D., roughly 300 years of history were artificially added to the calendar, invented, not lived. If true, this would mean that much of the so-called Dark Ages was never real. It was a phantom, a historical illusion. At first, the idea sounds absurd. How could centuries be fabricated without people noticing? And yet, when researchers began to compare records, strange cracks appeared in the story we've been told. Consider this. From the 5th to the 9th century, Europe's historical records are astonishingly thin. Letters, chronicles, first-hand accounts, the raw material of history, nearly vanish. What remains are vague, repetitive, often written centuries after the events they describe. Major rulers emerge from the shadows, yet leave behind almost nothing concrete. Entire dynasties appear and disappear like smoke. Even the great Charlemagne, the supposed father of Europe, crowned in the year 800, leaves behind an unsettling mystery. His life, campaigns, and reforms mirror those of an earlier emperor, Constantine the Great. Their reigns are so similar, some historians whisper, was Charlemagne simply a copy of Constantine, written into a different century? One of the strongest arguments for phantom centuries comes not from parchment, but from the heavens. Astronomy allows us to calculate the exact dates of eclipses and celestial events going back thousands of years. Ancient Greek, Jewish, and Chinese records of eclipses align perfectly with these calculations. But in Europe, during the Dark Ages, the match breaks down. Eclipses said to have happened never occurred. Events said to be witnessed under darkened skies took place in full daylight. Sometimes the eras stretch not by days or weeks, but by decades. The stars are incorruptible, and when the stars do not agree with the history books, suspicion grows. Who would benefit? But if time was fabricated, who stood to gain? The theory points to 3 names: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor in the year 1000, Pope Sylvester II, a monk and scholar later elevated to the papacy, and of course, the Vatican itself. Imagine the motive. Otto desired to rein in the fabled year 1000, a number steeped in prophecy and divine symbolism. By inserting extra centuries, his rule could be aligned with sacred destiny. For the Church, the benefit was even greater. By rewriting timelines, it could create an unbroken chain of authority stretching back to Peter himself. Popes could be slotted seamlessly into missing centuries, saints canonized precisely where history had gaps, relics discovered at the perfect time. To manipulate the calendar is to manipulate prophecy. To alter time is to alter destiny. Perhaps most disturbing of all is not the theory itself, but the response to it. The Vatican has never officially denied it, but neither have they confirmed it. They remain silent, just as they have for centuries whenever questions cut too close to hidden truths. And silence is not neutrality. Silence is power. When you hold the keys to the archives, when you alone possess the manuscripts, the maps, the genealogies, you need not argue. You need only wait. Doubt dies. Power endures. If phantom centuries were indeed inserted, then history itself becomes a stage. Dynasties may be fictional characters. Wars may be copies of earlier conflicts. Even time, the one constant we believe unshakable, becomes a crafted illusion. Picture a theater. The audience sees only the actors and the scenery placed on stage. They never see the ropes, the pulleys, the stage hands, and the shadows. Europe during the Dark Ages may have been just that, a stage curated by scribes, designed by rulers, directed by the Church. 3 centuries? Invented? If the phantom time hypothesis is even partly true, then the world we live in may not be what it seems. Our calendars, our timelines, even the year we call today, could be wrong. And if time itself can be forged, what else has been shaped, hidden, or erased? The answer lies deeper still in the one institution that guarded every manuscript, every secret, every silence: the Vatican. When Rome fell, empires vanished, kingdoms rose and collapsed, but one institution endured, silent, steady, and immovable: the Church. And at its heart, hidden beneath centuries of ritual and reverence, lies the greatest vault of knowledge on earth, the Vatican secret archives. Beneath the stones of Vatican City, past guarded doors and locked gates, stretches a labyrinth of shelves said to contain over 50 kilometers of manuscripts, more than 1 million documents, some dating back over 1,000 years. No tourist will ever see them. No curious scholar can wander freely between the stacks. Access is strictly limited. Requests must be specific, permissions rarely granted, and copies are forbidden. The name itself is revealing: Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. In Latin, secretum did not mean secret in the modern sense, but private, a clever shield of words. We are not hiding history, they insist. We are simply keeping it private. But if privacy conceals knowledge that could alter the world's understanding of itself, is it still just privacy? Turn to the papal lists of the 8th to 10th centuries, and you'll find names like Sabinian, Stephen III, Valentine, Donus II, and John XIV. But here is the problem. Outside of Vatican records, there is almost no evidence these men ever lived. No independent chronicles, no relics, no decisions that shaped kingdoms, just vague entries in Vatican manuscripts. Could some of these popes have been invented? inserted into the record to fill blank centuries, to maintain the illusion of an unbroken chain back to Saint Peter? For the Church, the motive is clear. Authority depended on lineage. The papacy had to appear eternal, sacred, uninterrupted. A broken chain would fracture divine legitimacy. So, if history left gaps, names were written in, and it did not stop with popes. During the very centuries most suspected of being phantom, saints begin to appear. Men and women canonized for miracles, martyrdom, or spreading the faith. Yet many leave behind no trace outside of church texts, no archaeology, no artifacts, only stories. Bones and relics surface just in time. Miracles are recorded conveniently in the precise centuries where history grows thin. Coincidence or construction? Saints provided not only spiritual inspiration, but political authority. They tied communities to Rome, justified pilgrimages, and kept the faithful loyal. By filling the silence with sanctity, the Church ensured no one questioned the silence itself. But perhaps the most shocking evidence of the Vatican's invisible hand lies not in names, but in maps. In 1513, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis drew a world map. On its parchment coastline appears South America, centuries before many European explorers claimed to know it existed. Even more baffling, part of Antarctica appears, without ice, as though drawn from sources far older than the age of exploration. Piri Reis himself admitted his map was compiled from ancient charts. Where are these source maps today? Many scholars point to one place: the Vatican archives. The Vatican is believed to hold one of the largest collections of ancient cartography in existence, yet less than 1% has ever been made public. What lies in the sealed majority remains unknown. Coastlines of forgotten continents, voyages erased from history, knowledge too disruptive to be shown. If maps define how humanity sees the world, then those who hold the maps hold the world itself. Step back, and a pattern emerges. Popes inserted into the record to maintain authority. Saints created to fill historical voids. Relics and miracles staged to sanctify silence. Maps hidden to control how humanity understood its place on earth. This was not destruction. It was curation, not chaos, but choreography. Europe's darkness may not have been the absence of progress, but the presence of invisible hands moving the pieces of history with calculated care. When an empire falls, its ruins remain. But when knowledge is hidden, when names and maps and memories are curated in secrecy, the ruins are not of stone. They are of truth itself. The Vatican's invisible hand did not simply guide Europe through the Dark Ages. It may have written the script of the Dark Ages altogether. And if history can be rewritten with ink and silence, what happens to those who dared to resist? Not every battle is fought with swords. Some wars are waged against ideas. And in the so-called Dark Ages, to think too freely was the gravest crime of all. Imagine living in a world where curiosity itself was dangerous, to ask the wrong question, to read the wrong book, to suggest the stars moved in ways different from Scripture. Any of these could brand you a heretic, and for heretics there was no forgiveness. The Church had inherited Rome's structures of power. But where Rome's enemies were crucified on roadsides, the Church's enemies were erased in silence or consumed by fire. Knowledge itself became contraband. Beginning in the 12th century, the Inquisition became the Church's most efficient weapon. Courts operated in secret. Accusations were enough. Evidence was not required. Torture extracted confessions, not truths. Sentences ended in imprisonment, exile, or the stake. A single whispered suspicion could condemn a neighbor. To survive, most chose silence, and silence served the church better than any sword. Books suffered the same fate as people. Manuscripts deemed dangerous were burned, entire libraries reduced to ash. Ideas that had taken lifetimes to write vanished in minutes, and the silence that followed was even more powerful than the flames. It made future generations believe those books had never existed at all. Bruno, the martyr of the stars. One man stands as a haunting symbol of this war against thought. Giordano Bruno, a philosopher and cosmologist, Bruno believed the universe was infinite, that the stars were suns, each with their own worlds, that God's creation was too vast to be contained by Scripture. For this, the Vatican condemned him. On a cold February morning in the year 1600, Bruno was burned alive in Rome's Campo de Fiore. As the flames rose, his lips moved not in prayer, but in defiance. He refused to recant. His crime was not sin, it was vision. The message was clear. The price of thinking beyond doctrine was death. Galileo, the prisoner of truth. Bruno's fate should have silenced others, but less than a generation later, Galileo Galilei lifted his crude telescope to the skies and saw something undeniable. The earth revolved around the sun. This discovery shattered centuries of theology. If earth was not the center, then mankind was not the center. And if mankind was not the center, what of the Church's claim to divine order? Galileo was tried by the Inquisition. Under threat of torture, he recanted publicly. Yet even in submission, he whispered words that have echoed through history. And yet it moves. He lived, but under house arrest until his death. His freedom stolen, his truth caged. Bruno and Galileo are remembered because their names survived, but for everyone remembered, thousands were lost. Monks who translated forbidden manuscripts, physicians who experimented with ancient remedies, historians who questioned the official timeline. They vanished, burned, silenced, erased, and in their place silence grew. Generation after generation learned not to ask. It is easy to forget how powerful silence can be. It is not merely the absence of sound, it is the shaping of memory. When all voices fall silent, the only voice left is the one in power. To live in medieval Europe was to learn complicity. Silence was not cowardice, it was survival. Parents taught children not to question. Scholars concealed their thoughts behind piety. Entire communities hid their doubts in shadows. This silence became culture. Culture became faith, and faith became control. By the time centuries had passed, people no longer remembered a world where asking questions was safe. They believed the silence was normal. The Inquisition did not merely burn heretics, it burned the very memory of resistance. Giordano Bruno's body turned to ash. Galileo's voice was chained in silence. Thousands of others were lost to fire, dungeons, or forgotten graves. But the greatest victory of all was not the deaths. It was the quiet that followed, a silence so deep, so enduring, that generations grew up believing there had been nothing to question. The Dark Ages were not only about what was hidden in archives, they were about what was burned in public squares. And yet, even fire cannot consume everything. In the shadows, in symbols, in whispers, fragments of truth survived. The flames of the Inquisition burned bright, the prisons filled, the silence deepened. But even in silence, resistance found a way. Where books could not be published, they were hidden. Where questions could not be spoken, they were coded into symbols. Where voices could not be raised, they whispered in secret halls. Knowledge did not die. It went underground. Not every monastery was a prison of thought. Some were sanctuaries. Among the Benedictines, Cistercians, and later the Dominicans, a few monks quietly copied not only scripture, but fragments of forbidden texts. They disguised geometry as diagrams of crosses. They hid the logic of Aristotle in theological commentary. It was dangerous work. Discovery meant execution. And yet, within cloisters, scraps of knowledge survived, waiting for centuries until the world was ready to receive them again. By the late Middle Ages, another group emerged, the alchemists. To the Church, alchemy was tolerated because it seemed mystical, a search for gold or immortality. But behind the veil of allegory, alchemists studied chemistry, metallurgy, and medicine. Their coded writings spoke of the philosopher's stone, but in truth described chemical transformations. They drew suns, moons, and serpents, symbols that cloaked real experiments in secrecy. Alchemy became a double language, mystical enough to escape the Church's wrath, scientific enough to keep progress alive. Where the Church demanded obedience, the alchemists demanded transformation, not of souls, but of matter. By the Renaissance, whispers of secret brotherhoods spread across Europe. The Freemasons, born from guilds of cathedral builders, carried not only the secrets of architecture, but also fragments of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy hidden in their rituals. The square and compass were not merely tools of craft. They were symbols of reason, geometry, and cosmic order. The Rosicrucians, a more mysterious sect, claimed access to ancient wisdom stretching back to Egypt and beyond. Their manifestos promised hidden knowledge of medicine, science, and the stars, all guarded from the eyes of the Church. Both societies shared one principle. The true seeker of knowledge must work in silence, guarded by symbols, protected by brotherhood. In a world where direct speech could cost a life, knowledge found safety in symbols. The rose stood for secrecy. The cross symbolized suffering and hidden truth. The compass and square represented order and rationality. Even playing cards, some historians suggest, carried coded lessons in mathematics and philosophy. Art became another refuge. Painters like Hieronymus Bosch and later Leonardo da Vinci filled canvases with symbols, surreal creatures, hidden geometries, subtle contradictions to doctrine. To the untrained eye, they were religious paintings. To the initiated, they were encrypted messages. Ideas also traveled by word of mouth. Merchants, travelers, and scholars moving knowledge across borders like contraband. An Arabic text on mathematics might arrive in Spain, translated secretly into Latin. A Greek manuscript preserved in Byzantium might pass into Italy through underground channels. Every whisper carried risk, but together they formed a network of resistance, fragile, hidden, but unbreakable. By the 14th century, these secret survivals began to break the surface. Ancient texts, once thought lost, appeared suddenly in Italy. Algebra re-entered Europe. Maps expanded. Medicine advanced. It was as if a dam had cracked, and the waters of knowledge long suppressed came flooding back. But the truth is simpler. The dam had been leaking all along. Secret societies had preserved the seeds. And when the time was right, those seeds bloomed into the Renaissance. The Dark Ages were not entirely dark. Beneath the silence, there were whispers. Beneath the fire, there were embers. Monks copied forbidden words in margins. Alchemists hid experiments in symbols. Freemasons and Rosicrucians passed secrets through handshakes, rituals, and codes. Knowledge survived not in open sunlight, but in hidden gardens, tended by those willing to risk everything. And when the Renaissance dawned, it was not a rebirth out of nothing. It was the return of truths carefully kept alive through centuries of silence. But the question remains, if the Renaissance revealed only what slipped through the cracks, how much still lies sealed, unseen, beneath Vatican stone? Was Europe truly plunged into 1,000 years of ignorance? Or was the Dark Ages itself a carefully crafted myth, a story written not by the people who lived it, but by those who came centuries later? The phrase saeculum obscurum, the Dark Age, first appeared in the 14th century. The Italian poet Petrarch looked back across time and saw nothing but shadows between the Roman Empire and his own day. But Petrarch was not a neutral observer. He was a man of the Renaissance, proud of the revival he saw around him. By calling the centuries before him dark, he made his own age shine brighter. Darkness was not description. It was contrast. It was marketing. Renaissance scholars found manuscripts hidden in monasteries, fragments of Plato, Aristotle, Galen. To them it seemed as though knowledge had been rediscovered after 1,000 years. But was it truly rediscovery or revelation of knowledge that had always been guarded, filtered, and rationed? By framing their age as rebirth, Renaissance thinkers crowned themselves saviors of civilization. In truth, they were beneficiaries of secrets preserved and suppressed by the Church. And so, the myth of 1,000 years of darkness was born. The 18th century brought another layer to the myth. Enlightenment philosophers seized the idea of the Dark Ages to prove their own superiority. Voltaire sneered at the medieval world as an age of superstition. Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, painted monks as destroyers of culture and the Church as an obstacle to progress. The Dark Ages became shorthand for everything the Enlightenment claimed to overcome: ignorance, repression, fanaticism, and the myth spread into classrooms, pamphlets, and eventually into the textbooks of modern education. Curiously, the Church never fought the label. They could have defended the centuries as times of order, culture, or even modest growth. Instead, they stayed quiet. Why? Because the myth served them too. By allowing the Middle Ages to be painted as dark, the Vatican could claim its guidance was the only light that had prevented civilization from vanishing entirely. The worse the age looked, the brighter the papacy shone in comparison. Silence once again served power. The 20th century cemented the myth in pictures. Films like The Name of the Rose or medieval epics depicted mud-soaked peasants, brutal inquisitors, and endless gloom. Even when heroes appeared, they fought against a backdrop of misery. Television documentaries reinforced it with narration. Europe slept while the rest of the world advanced. It was history turned into image. An image is far harder to challenge than words. Yet the Middle Ages were not barren. They saw the Gothic cathedrals, soaring structures of stone and glass requiring immense engineering skill, agricultural revolutions, the heavy plow, the horse collar, crop rotation that fed millions more than before. Universities quietly forming in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, planting the seeds of modern scholarship. Even moments of creativity, music, illuminated manuscripts, epics like Beowulf and the Song of Roland. These achievements are rarely acknowledged because they complicate the story. A dark age must remain dark to preserve the myth. The Dark Ages were not only a period, they became a metaphor. Politicians, writers, and educators use the phrase to describe backwardness anywhere, tyranny, ignorance, stagnation. By branding a millennium as darkness, later ages secured their own claim to light. And once a lie becomes useful, it is repeated until it becomes truth. The Dark Ages may never have been truly dark. They were made dark, painted so by poets, philosophers, politicians, and priests. 1,000 years reduced to a single word, ignorance. But if history itself can be branded, then what else has been branded into myth? The answer may lie in the archives that remain sealed, in the documents we are forbidden to see. History is not only about what is remembered, it is about what is kept hidden. And nowhere is more hidden than beneath the stones of the Vatican. The Vatican Apostolic Archives stretch for miles beneath the city, more than 50 kilometers of shelves, manuscripts bound in leather, maps drawn by ancient hands, letters sealed in wax centuries ago. Climate-controlled chambers preserve parchment that could crumble at a touch. Locked cabinets guard books deemed too dangerous to open. Few are allowed inside. Even fewer are allowed to publish what they see. For the rest of the world, these shelves may as well not exist. From 1559 until 1966, the Vatican kept the Index of Forbidden Books. Thousands of titles were banned, not only pagan works, but also scientific treatises, political philosophy, even novels. Books by Galileo, Descartes, Pascal, Voltaire, Rousseau. The index was abolished in the 20th century, but the books themselves remain under lock and key. A blacklist that lasted 400 years does not simply vanish. Whispers from scholars and archivists suggest the vaults contain lost gospels, writings of early Christians whose visions of Christ differ radically from the canonical four. Ancient maps, some depicting Antarctica without ice, others showing knowledge of the Americas long before Columbus. Letters of rulers, including emperors and kings, negotiating with popes in secret, altering alliances and timelines. Scientific manuscripts, centuries ahead of their time, suppressed for contradicting doctrine. If these texts were ever revealed, the narrative of world history might collapse overnight. What if they opened tomorrow? Imagine for a moment that the Vatican opened every vault tomorrow, that every map, every letter, every lost gospel was released online for the world to see. How many centuries would need to be rewritten? How many saints would vanish into legend? How many rulers would lose their crowns of legitimacy? Would the year we call today even be correct? If history itself was engineered, then opening the vaults would not simply reveal the past. It would destroy the present. Perhaps the true Dark Ages never ended. Perhaps they are not 1,000 years in the past, but the silence we still live in today, a silence of secrets, sealed archives, and carefully curated narratives. Every unopened cabinet in the Vatican is another unlit corner of history. Every forbidden manuscript is another missing century. Every secret map is another hidden truth. The Dark Ages may not have been ignorance. They may have been imprisonment. And perhaps we are still imprisoned. For 1,000 years, Europe's memory was not lost. It was managed. For 1,000 years, knowledge was not destroyed. It was hidden. For 1,000 years, truth was not forgotten. It was rewritten. And now the greatest question remains, what else lies in the dark?